Welcome to the Deep Dive. Tonight, we are turning our attention eastward, settling into a very deep and quiet study of one of the world's most enduring and, I think, most perplexing economies, Japan.
It really is a study in economic patience. While you see global headlines that are often, screaming about dramatic financial crises or explosive growth, Japan offers something quite different. It's a long, slow, and surprisingly stable plateau. We're going to be exploring the sources that explain how the world's fourth largest economy arrived at this current, almost suspended state.
And that quiet paradox is really the central point of reflection for our deep dive tonight. When you consider the sheer scale of the achievement, a global leader in high-speed rail, cutting-edge robotics, advanced electronics, the contradiction becomes almost haunting. For the last 3 decades, Japan has experienced an unprecedented stagnation in real wages and in asset prices.
It's the economic inverse of nearly every other major developed nation. While countries across the globe have engaged in these heated battles against rising inflation since the late 2000s, Japan has spent the past 30 years in a desperate struggle to create inflation.
They create it.
Yes, they've been trying to intentionally raise prices just enough to escape a persistent, debilitating cycle of outright deflation that began after their great asset bubble burst in the early 1990s.
And this story isn't one of a sudden, dramatic collapse. It's a narrative of a slow, almost silent crisis that began at the very moment Japan seemed absolutely invincible. So our mission tonight is to understand not just the mechanism of this deceleration, but also how this quiet crisis might have resulted in the world's first truly successful post-growth economy. What does economic stability look like when that fundamental driver of continuous expansion has stalled?
To really appreciate the depth of this long deceleration, I think we first have to establish the breathtaking height that Japan reached. We need to ground ourselves in the sheer velocity of their initial ascent.
Exactly. Let's take a moment to explore those foundational decades of rapid growth, which laid the infrastructure for both the miracle and, eventually, the rigid constraints that followed.
The starting point after this surrender in 1945 was one of near total devastation. Estimates show that cities were flattened, industrial capacity was severely damaged, and an astonishing 82% of its merchant fleet.
Which is the lifeblood of an island nation.
The absolute lifeblood. It was gone. The task of just rebuilding was immense.
But that immediate post-war period was defined by radical, almost revolutionary social and economic restructuring. And this was mandated by the Allied occupation force. The reforms they were comprehensive. They were aimed at dismantling the old power structures that had led to militarism.
And key among these was, of course, the complete demilitarization and the establishment of a democratic parliamentary government. But crucially, they introduced fundamental economic reforms that redefined corporate power and societal wealth distribution. The massive industrial and financial conglomerates known as the zaibatsu, these were families that controlled vast sectors of the economy, they were forcefully broken up through the Anti-Monopoly Act.
And this was a seismic shift. Before the war, these groups controlled immense centralized power. Breaking them up wasn't just an economic measure, it was a radical political act. It was designed to spread wealth and economic opportunity more broadly across the whole country.
And beyond that, the land reforms were arguably one of the most successful wealth redistribution programs of the entire 20th century. Under a comprehensive government program, something like 38% of all agricultural land was purchased, and then it was resold at low, subsidized prices to the tenant farmers who actually worked it. And this fundamentally shifted wealth from a very small class of rural landowners to the working class.
And critically, workers gained unprecedented rights. The right to organize and unionize was protected, and union membership just soared from a marginal 3.2% in 1945 to a staggering 53% by 1948.
A huge jump.
A huge jump. And this high unionization rate was foundational. It eventually led to the famous annual Shinto, or the Spring Wage Offensive, which institutionalized strong across-the-board wage growth and really cemented that stable, lifetime employment model that Japan became famous for.
So this new, more egalitarian and restructured society was then injected with a massive stimulant, the rise of the Cold War. The United States quickly shifted its strategy from punitive restructuring to building Japan up as a strategic capitalist stronghold in Asia.
And the moment of true acceleration came with the Korean War in the early 1950s. Japan became a crucial logistical and manufacturing base for U.S. and UN forces.
Right.
This created an immense sudden demand for Japanese manufactured goods, reviving dormant factories and kicking the economy into high gear almost overnight.
And from this pivot point, the economic miracle really began. Japan focused intensely on investment, on industrialization, and on becoming a dominant global exporter. They transitioned from a producer of cheap post-war goods to a world leader in precision electronics and heavy industry.
The growth statistics from, say, 1955 through 1989 they're almost unbelievable. Real GDP increased by nearly 500%. For years, growth rates averaged around 10% annually. It was just this relentless march forward.
Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda famously set a goal in 1960 to double the national income in 10 years, which is a highly ambitious public declaration. But it was not only achieved, it was dramatically exceeded. They reached that goal in only 7 years.
Wow.
And this built immense public faith in the government's ability to just deliver continuous prosperity.
And their success wasn't based solely on cheap labor or exports. It relied profoundly on investing in human capital. By 1960, the secondary school enrollment rate in Japan was already higher than the average across industrialized Western economies.
So they had this highly skilled, highly literate workforce ready to step into these very high productive, complex manufacturing sectors.
This relentless momentum carried them right into the 1980s, which truly marked the zenith of global economic confidence. Japan was universally perceived as being a decade ahead of the rest of the world, both technologically and structurally.
Technological dominance was everywhere. I mean, you think of the launch of the Sony Walkman in 1979. It wasn't just a convenient device. It was a psychological milestone.
Right.
The ability to carry personalized, high-fidelity music, which was unheard of at the time, it felt like a massive futuristic leap, maybe even more disruptive to consumer tech at the time than the iPhone was decades later.
And they had bullet trains, advanced robotics, next-generation memory chips.
By the time the bubble peaked in 1989, the sheer scale of their financial power was just staggering. If you looked at a list of the world's top 20 global firms by market capitalization, 15 of them were Japanese.
15 out of 20.
The stock market had exploded, rising from 29% of GDP in 1980 to 151% by 1989.
There was this overwhelming collective psychological state of invincibility. The belief was not just that Japan would grow, but that this expansion was their inevitable destiny. They were poised to surpass the United States as the world's largest economy. It was a feeling fueled by an almost spiritual faith in their own system.
Which makes the turning point so critical. As we transition into the shift, you can see how this very sense of technological and financial invincibility became a major liability when external pressures and domestic policy errors converged to create this devastating speculative boom.
And that pivot point really centers on a powerful geopolitical intervention in 1985, the Plaza Accord. By the mid-1980s, the U.S. was facing politically unmanageable trade deficits, particularly with Japan, whose efficient manufacturing was seen as an existential threat to American industries like automotive.
So in September of 1985, the finance ministers of the G5 nations, the U.S., Japan, West Germany, France, and the U.K., they all met at the Plaza Hotel in New York. The agreed-upon goal was to collectively intervene in currency markets to deliberately weaken the U.S. dollar.
And this action, by necessity, meant strengthening the currencies of the other nations, most crucially, the Japanese yen.
For the U.S., this was a clear desired outcome. A weaker dollar made American exports cheaper and more competitive globally. But for Japan, an economy built entirely on exporting manufactured goods, this was a devastating policy shift.
A huge problem.
A huge problem. The sudden, artificially higher yen made their products significantly more expensive overseas, threatening their core economic engine.
And the immediate impact was exactly as feared. The yen appreciated violently, surging by over 50% in less than 2 years. Japanese export growth went from a really robust plus 15% in 1984 to a crushing 9.5% by 1986.
Factories were indeed struggling, and the risk of a severe, politically dangerous recession was immediate.
It's worth pausing here just for a moment to reflect on that political calculation. I mean, why did Japan agree to this detrimental deal?
It was a choice born of dependency. As an island nation with very few natural resources, Japan relies entirely on the West for raw materials, for energy, and critically for its food supply. Harming that deep, symbiotic trade relationship by refusing the Plaza Accord would have created an even worse long-term dependency crisis than accepting the exchange rate shift.
Right.
It was a strategic sacrifice to maintain geopolitical stability.
But sacrificing the exporter base required an immediate and powerful domestic response to prevent a sharp recession. And this is where the policy misstep really began. The Bank of Japan, or the BOJ, decided to aggressively slash interest rates to stimulate domestic demand.
They took rates from over 5% in 1985 down to a record low of 2.5% by February 1987. The thinking was straightforward. Make borrowing incredibly cheap to encourage companies to invest domestically and offset the lost income from exports.
And they did more than just cut rates. They relaxed their long-standing window guidance, which was essentially direct administrative instructions given to commercial banks on how much they could lend and where. By loosening this guidance, they basically unleashed the financial system.
And the result was predictable. Cheap, accessible credit just flooded the economy. Banks began lending aggressively, increasingly viewing appreciating land and stock portfolios as rock-solid collateral, and that led to one of the world's greatest speculative manias.
This combination of easy money and that widely held belief in perpetual growth just fueled the bubble. Asset prices began to rise not based on underlying productivity or income, but purely on the expectation that they would be worth more tomorrow. It became a massive, self-fulfilling prophecy of speculation.
The scale of the land speculation alone is still difficult to grasp today. Land values in major cities just soared, and the prices reached a pinnacle of absurdity. A single square meter in Tokyo's Ginza shopping district was rumored to have sold for 32 million yen.
Astounding.
At its peak in 1989, the total real estate value of Tokyo alone was estimated to be equal to the value of the entire landmass of the United States.
And this wasn't just corporate speculation. It entered the cultural fabric. Golf club memberships, which were seen as status symbols and tradable assets, they turned into luxury financial vehicles, sometimes costing over $1 million just to join. The total market value of these memberships was estimated at an astonishing $200 billion.
Meanwhile, major manufacturing companies started leveraging this speculative environment through what was called Zytech, or financial engineering. These weren't financial firms, but industrial giants. Yet they started deriving substantial portions of their profits, in some documented cases, over half not from manufacturing cars or electronics, but from trading securities and stocks.
They were viewing these portfolio assets as hidden assets that were guaranteed to appreciate.
Right. It shifted the entire incentive structure. Why endure the difficulty of innovation and production when the easiest money was made by becoming, essentially, a proprietary trading desk? The stock market reflected this dangerous exuberance, soaring to 151% of Japan's GDP by the late 80s.
And here is where we must focus on the fatal instability of the system, which was rooted in the banking sector. The boom relied on a dangerous, circular, self-reinforcing mechanism.
As the stock market continued to rise, the value of the bank's cross-shareholdings, these long-term stocks they held in other companies, which counted toward their regulatory capital, also increased dramatically.
Which then inflated their capital base.
Exactly. And that inflated capital base then enabled the banks to lend out even more money, often based on collateral that was increasingly speculative property. That new flood of lending, in turn, drove asset speculation and stock prices higher still, completing the loop.
The system was feeding itself.
It was feeding itself, relying entirely on continuous upward asset appreciation to maintain the solvency of the banks and the corporate balance sheets.
It was a house built not just on sand, but on the optimistic promise that the sand would grow exponentially heavier. And even when the 1987 global stock market crash happened, the Japanese market recovered better than others, which only solidified the dangerous belief that the government would simply never let the music stop.
The sheer volume of liquidity was staggering. A policy change in 1988 abolished tax-exempt postal savings accounts, which released an estimated 300 trillion yen, that's over $2 trillion, into the economy, much of which was quickly channeled into this speculative fever.
But the bubble, constructed on cheap credit and circular collateral, was entirely unsustainable. So now we transition into the fallout, the slow, cold period of reckoning, and the psychological shift that would define the next 3 decades, the era that we now know as the lost decades.
The decision to end the party was made quietly on Christmas Day in 1989 when Yasushi Mieno, the new governor of the BOJ, took the reins. He had the explicit and very unpopular goal of pricking the bubble.
He ordered the first in a series of sharp interest rate hikes. The BOJ raised rates 5 times over the next 8 months, reaching 6% by August 1990. This rapid monetary tightening, combined with the extreme leverage in the market and a sudden loss of investor confidence, brought the asset speculation to an abrupt and violent halt.
The decline was steep and it was relentless. And the Nikkei dropped a massive 60% by 1992, effectively wiping out the paper wealth created during the 1980s. Property prices followed, falling 60% or more from their peak in some major metropolitan areas over the course of the decade.
And the collapse left the banking sector in catastrophic shape, weighed down by mortgages and loans based on collateral that had just evaporated. But the deepest, most lasting damage was the psychological transformation and the onset of this crippling deflationary trap.
Falling asset prices caused deflation, a sustained decline in the general price level. And in a deflationary environment, the real value of debt actually increases, meaning the same loan burden becomes exponentially heavier over time as income shrinks.
But I think more damaging was the consumer psychology. The memory of the crash became deeply ingrained. Why would a household spend money today when they expect prices to be lower tomorrow and their wages are stagnant?
And that expectation of future decline leads households to perpetually pull back from consumption. Businesses, seeing demand shrink, can't justify new investment or hiring, which creates slower growth, which in turn validates the expectation of lower prices.
It's the core crippling cycle of deflation.
It is, and once you're locked in, it is immensely difficult to break.
What's fascinating and really tragic about this period is the banking sector's response. Instead of implementing radical, painful solutions, forcing companies to face their debts, or allowing unproductive firms to fail, a process we call creative destruction, they chose avoidance.
They engaged in what's called evergreening, where they gave struggling companies breaks, lowered interest rates, deferred payments, or even forgiving parts of the debt. These loans, unlikely to ever be repaid but kept formally on the books, were termed zombie loans.
And this created hundreds of billions of dollars worth of financial fiction, locking capital into what became known as zombie enterprises, companies that were technically insolvent but kept alive by artificially low credit and deferrals.
The motivation was social stability, prioritizing the continuation of employment and avoiding widespread bankruptcies that might ignite a political crisis. But the economic cost of this delay was immense. The necessary cleanup of these bad debts took a crippling 6 to 10 years.
And during that critical decade, capital and human resources were just locked up. They remained trapped in unproductive, inefficient companies that couldn't grow, severely hindering the formation of new dynamic businesses and blocking the natural economic recovery that follows a bust. Japan prioritized social cohesion over economic dynamism, and it paid a very long-term price for it.
Faced with this persistent deflation, Japan pioneered the use of radical monetary policies that would later be adopted globally. They faced what's called a liquidity trap, where monetary policy becomes largely ineffective because interest rates are already near zero, making it impossible to stimulate borrowing any further.
So to combat this, the BOJ kept its benchmark interest rates at or near zero for over 20 years, trying every imaginable mechanism to discourage saving and encourage investment. They even ventured into negative interest rates, reaching near 0.1% at one point.
And critically, Japan was the first country in the world to unleash quantitative easing, or QE. This involves the central bank buying massive amounts of government and corporate bonds from commercial banks for cash.
The goal being to flood the economy with liquidity and raise the money supply, hoping the banks would then lend that cash out and stimulate activity.
Despite these radical, unprecedented measures, which also included massive government spending on public works, the results were consistently underwhelming. The economy remained mired in this cycle of near-zero inflation or outright deflation. The structural rigidity and that deep psychological caution proved too strong for monetary policy to overcome.
And this sustained lack of growth meant that Japanese wages, which had been institutionally linked to rising productivity and inflation since the post-war era, remained largely flat for decades. In real terms, Japanese workers saw their purchasing power improve only marginally, if at all, over 30 years. It was an economic performance as poor as some of the slowest-growing European nations.
So the story of the lost decades is really a study in the limitations of policy. It shows us what happens when a devastating crash is met with a delayed cleanup, and how entrenched negative consumer psychology can render even the most radical monetary tools ineffective.
This brings us to the post-growth reality, where we can deep dive into the underlying cultural and demographic factors that cemented the stagnation. And we can contrast that economic rigidity with the surprising stability of modern Japanese life.
I think one of the most significant constraints is cultural inertia, particularly a deep-seated risk aversion in the corporate world that really stifled innovation. The trauma of the 1990 crash left an indelible mark.
Japan has always prided itself on perfection, stability, and specialization. When that stable world shattered, the fear of failure became far stronger than the desire for dynamic success. Companies became intensely conservative, prioritizing balance sheet stability and loyalty over aggressive market disruption. They lost the willingness to take the radical, venture-backed risks that defined competitors in Silicon Valley.
And this risk aversion is mirrored in the regulatory environment. Starting a new business remains a complicated, bureaucratically heavy process. Japan ranks relatively poorly globally for the ease of doing business, defined by endless paperwork, complex government approvals, and multi-layered regulations that favor incumbents over innovative startups.
The lack of global integration also plays a quiet but profound role. English is the widely accepted language of modern technology development, global finance, and scientific cooperation. Yet, due to a highly focused domestic education system, estimates suggest only around 8% of the Japanese population speaks English fluently.
And this creates a powerful, self-imposed linguistic barrier to integrating into the fastest-growing global technological and financial flows.
In essence, the country that once symbolized the technological edge, the producer of the Walkman and the bullet train, became trapped by a combination of fear, hierarchy, and a reluctance to embrace the messy, dynamic change required for modern innovation.
But the most powerful structural constraint of all is the demographic crisis, which serves as the starkest canary in the coal mine for the rest of the developed world, especially Europe and China.
Japan now has the oldest population globally, with a median age approaching 50. The ratio of retirees to workers is rapidly deteriorating. In 1990, there were 5 working-age people for every retiree.
By the middle of this century, projections show that number dropping to just 2.
You simply cannot maintain GDP growth when the workforce that produces the goods and the customer base that consumes them are physically shrinking year after year.
And unlike almost every other major industrialized economy facing this challenge, Japan has virtually resisted the use of immigration to offset the decline. Less than 3% of its residents are foreign-born. And this resistance is deeply rooted in cultural priorities, where the national identity is often associated with maintaining homogeneity, viewing mass immigration as a threat to societal balance.
The social consequences are already vast. Local villages are vanishing, schools are closing due to a lack of students, and the entire national infrastructure and economic priorities are shifting, becoming heavily geared towards serving an aging, less productive population.
This aging and rigid structure also fuels the productivity problem we discussed earlier. The traditional Japanese system of lifetime employment, which is a wonderful social safety net, creates deep inefficiencies in a non-growing environment.
Companies retain workers long past their peak productivity or necessity.
And this leads to the phenomenon of busy work, or outright sidelining employees, sometimes referred to by the term Madogi Wazoku, literally, the window-side tribe. Employees who are essentially paid to watch the world go by because firing them is culturally or structurally impossible.
So this means that while Japan boasts a high overall employment rate, the sheer volume of unproductive jobs drags down overall per capita efficiency. At its economic peak, Japan was often compared favorably to the U.S. in terms of productivity. Today, it's significantly lower, compounding the issue of a shrinking workforce.
And yet, despite this decades-long economic stagnation, the nation remains remarkably clean, safe, modern, and maintains an extremely high quality of life. This is the great paradox. The absence of growth is not equated to social collapse or mass misery.
In fact, the absence of perpetual growth expectations has quietly solved one of the defining crises of the Western world: affordable housing. With no pervasive belief that asset prices will continuously inflate, homes are seen as consumable, depreciating items like cars, not guaranteed investments.
Planning restrictions are often looser, allowing easier replacement and construction, and the result is housing that is relatively affordable compared to, say, London or New York, even in major metropolitan areas like Tokyo. You can buy a house without the crushing leverage seen in high-growth areas, though you have to accept that these spaces are typically smaller than Western counterparts.
Crucially, the persistent low inflation environment means that stagnant nominal wages have maintained their real purchasing power domestically. Because businesses were culturally resistant to raising prices, they could sustain operations without the wage increases seen in high inflation environments, allowing citizens to maintain a sustainable cost of living without hypervolatility.
Furthermore, Japan has developed an incredibly effective mechanism for maintaining social fluidity, even without growth. A steep inheritance tax, ranging from 10% up to 55% for the wealthiest estates.
Think of it this way. In an economy where the pie is no longer expanding, wealth naturally concentrates in stagnant assets, and it can quickly solidify class boundaries. The inheritance tax acts as a powerful redistributive force. It ensures that those born poor still have a practical chance to move up, even when new economic opportunities aren't being created exponentially.
This tax forces the wealthy to liquidate assets or pay substantial duties, preventing the simple, untaxed passing down of massive fortunes. It's a vital, often overlooked social lubricant in an economy where ambition has been replaced by endurance.
And this ingenuity in maintaining stability and social equity in the face of zero growth is why Japan is increasingly referred to as the world's first successful post-growth economy. The national goal has fundamentally shifted from chasing rapid expansion to successfully holding on to the very high standards of stability and quality of life it already possesses.
So now we move to the very recent past uncharted territory, defined by a major hesitant policy reversal from the Bank of Japan, a shift that carries significant global implications.
After decades of the ultra-loose monetary policy designed to fight deflation, the BOJ finally found the sustained evidence it needed to confirm that inflation was genuinely returning and likely to stick around. And this confirmation wasn't based on their policies, but on the strength of the labor market.
The definitive signal came from the annual shunto, or the centralized spring wage negotiations. The 2024 talks resulted in a substantial 5.28% increase in wages, the largest increase seen in 33 years. This finally exceeded the roughly 3% inflation rate, confirming to the BOJ that inflation was backed by genuine demand and labor strength rather than just temporary cost push factors like energy prices.
And this prompted the BOJ to make a major symbolic and material shift in March 2024. They ended their negative interest rate policy, bringing rates up to a positive, albeit small, territory. Simultaneously, they terminated their yield curve control, or YCC.
To understand the magnitude of this, we really have to define YCC. You have a radical policy where the BOJ publicly announced a specific yield target for long-term government bonds. For example, keeping the 10-year bond yield capped at 0.5% or 1.0%.
The mechanism was simple but effective. If the market tried to push the interest rate higher than that cap, the BOJ would automatically step in and buy unlimited quantities of those bonds. This massive, continuous intervention artificially suppressed long-term borrowing costs, which was necessary to manage the nation's colossal debt. So ending YCC is a massive step towards market normalization.
However, the market reaction following this historic rate hike was, well, it was counterintuitive and volatile. While a normalization of policy should typically see the yen strengthen dramatically, it actually weakened further against the US dollar immediately following the announcement. And this leads us directly to the currency roller coaster caused by the global carry trade.
The carry trade is a staple of global finance, and Japan was its key lubricant. Because Japanese interest rates were ultra-low, near zero or negative compared to the significantly higher rates in the US, investors had a powerful incentive. They would borrow cheap yen, sell that yen to buy dollars, and then invest the proceeds in much higher yield US Treasury bonds.
This action artificially weakened the yen by creating massive selling pressure, which had the side effect of boosting Japanese export revenue and competitiveness. It was a kind of hidden subsidy to the export sector maintained by the BOJ's ultra-low rate policy.
And the danger now lies in a reversal threat. As Japan begins to slowly hike rates and the U.S. contemplates eventual rate cuts, the incentive for this massive carry trade unwinds. Investors start bringing money back home to lock in profits, which requires them to buy yen rapidly.
This rapid repatriation forces the yen to appreciate quickly. That appreciation, however, immediately makes Japanese exports less competitive and less profitable, leading to wild swings in currency and stock markets. The transition back to a normal economy will be incredibly bumpy because the carry trade is a multi-trillion-dollar mechanism that resists change slowly and violently.
Compounding this normalization challenge is the enormous debt time bomb sitting at the heart of the Japanese government's finances. Government debt is currently nearly 250% of GDP, the highest among all developed nations.
And this debt has been managed for years only because the interest rate was near zero. Furthermore, the debt is largely held domestically, with the BOJ literally creating money to buy over 50% of the outstanding government debt, effectively owing money to itself to keep the financial system stable.
As interest rates now begin to rise, even gradually, the cost of servicing this enormous mountain of debt is expected to double in the coming years. This will place immense and unsustainable pressure on government finances, inevitably forcing politically difficult choices like significant tax increases or sharp spending cuts, precisely at a time when the elderly population requires more social support.
And furthermore, normalization threatens the corporate sector. We discussed the over 500,000 zombie enterprises that were kept alive during the lost decades, precisely because they could rely on near-zero interest rate loans.
Higher rates could trigger a long-delayed, necessary wave of domestic bankruptcies as these companies become unprofitable and can no longer service their cheaper debt.
The BOJ is navigating this normalization with extreme caution. It's effectively paralyzed by this debt time bomb. They confirmed that while they ended the negative rate policy, they would maintain the initial volume of government bond purchases for the time being.
And this caution explains the counterintuitive market reaction. The yen fell because investors saw the rate hike as not aggressive enough. They believe the BOJ will be forced to maintain an artificially loose monetary policy, even in the face of inflation, because the financial cost to the government of a truly normalized rate environment would be too high to bear.
Ultimately, Japan's entire crazy economics experiment serves as an incredibly important pathfinder for the rest of the world. It provides a unique warning and a potential roadmap.
Japan's trajectory, decades of overconfidence and overinvestment leading to a massive asset bubble, followed by a crippling demographic slowdown and policy paralysis, is now a script being followed by other major economies. Most notably, China is currently experiencing a very similar property bust after years of unchecked overconfidence and massive overinvestment in infrastructure and real estate.
Japan's history shows what happens after the growth boom, when the natural progress slows, and when a society becomes too rigid, too risk-averse, or too debt-laden to change its economic path quickly.
As we conclude our deep, quiet dive, we can summarize Japan's unique position with a sense of reflective admiration. The nation is not in chaos. It maintains remarkable stability, institutional strength, and high living standards. It's a testament to its cultural resilience and ability to adapt socially, even if not economically.
Its goal seems to have fundamentally shifted from dynamic growth to institutional maintenance. Endurance has replaced ambition. It is now focused not on chasing exponential economic expansion, but on successfully holding on to the very high standards of stability and quality of life it has already achieved. It truly is the world's first advanced post-growth economy.
And this gentle stagnation is becoming the world's mirror. Japan's specific struggles, the aging population, the suffocating debt, the growing disillusionment with perpetual economic expansion, are increasingly becoming universal struggles across the developed world.
Perhaps the fundamental assumption of the entire 20th century, the expectation that economies could and would continue to grow exponentially forever was inherently naive.
If sustained global growth slows for everyone, as Japan's history suggests is possible, the solutions won't be found in further aggressive growth-focused monetary policies like perpetual quantitative easing or printing money. Those tools ultimately hit a cultural wall.
Instead, the focus must shift inward and institutionally. Re-examining how to fairly allocate stagnant resources, how to maintain social mobility through non-growth mechanisms like the inheritance tax, and how we define national success when the economic pie is no longer expanding.
The fundamental question Japan poses to all of us as we settle into reflection is this: what existing assumptions about your own financial future or the future of your children are you currently basing on the continued, often unexamined expectation of perpetual economic growth?